It's better to recapitulate from the present to the past because the memories of the present are fresh. And in this manner, the recollection ability is honed. What practitioners do is to recollect and breathe. They inhale slowly and deliberately, fanning the head from right to left in a barely noticeable swing, and exhale in the same fashion. He said that the inhalations and exhalations should be natural. If they were too rapid, one would enter into something that he called tiring breaths, breaths that required slower breathing afterward in order to calm down the muscles. "And what do you want me to do, Don Juan, with all this?" I asked. "You are making your list today," he said. "Divide it by years, by occupations, arrange it in any order you want to, but make it sequential with the most recent person first and end with Mommy and Daddy. And then, remember everything about them. No more ado than that. As you practice, you'll realize what you're doing." On my next visit to his house, I told Don Juan that I had been meticulously going through the events of my life and that it was very difficult for me to adhere to his strict format and follow my list of persons one by one. Ordinarily, my recapitulation took me every which way. I let the events decide the direction of my recollection. What I did, which was volitional, was to adhere to a general unit of time. For instance, I'd begun with the people in the anthropology department, but I let my recollection pull me to anywhere in time, from the present to the day I started attending school at UCLA. I told Don Juan that an odd thing I'd found out, which I had completely forgotten, was that I had no idea that UCLA existed until one night when my girlfriend's roommate from college came to Los Angeles and we picked her up at the airport. She was going to study musicology at UCLA. Her plane arrived in the early evening, and she asked me if I could take her to the campus so she could take a look at the place where she was going to spend the next 4 years of her life. I knew where the campus was, for I had driven past its entrance on Sunset Boulevard endless times on my way to the beach. I had never been on the campus, though. It was during the semester break. The few people that we found directed us to the music department. The campus was deserted, but what I witnessed subjectively was the most exquisite thing I have ever seen. It was a delight to my eyes. The buildings seemed to be alive with some energy of their own. What was going to be a very cursory visit to the music department turned out to be a gigantic tour of the entire campus. I fell in love with UCLA. I mentioned to Don Juan that the only thing that marred my ecstasy was my girlfriend's annoyance at my insistence on walking through the huge campus. "What the hell could be in here?" she yelled at me in protest. "It's as if you've never seen a university campus in your life. You've seen one, you've seen them all. I think you're just trying to impress my friend with your sensitivity." I wasn't, and I vehemently told him that I was genuinely impressed by the beauty of my surroundings. I sensed so much hope in those buildings, so much promise, and yet I couldn't express my subjective state. "I've been in school nearly all my life," my girlfriend said through clenched teeth, "and I'm sick and tired of it. Nobody's going to find shit in here. All you find is guff, and they don't even prepare you to meet your responsibilities in life." When I mentioned that I would like to attend school here, she became even more furious. "Get a job," she screamed. "Go and meet life from 8 to 5 and cut the crap. That's what life is, a job from 8 to 5, 40 hours a week. See what it does to you. Look at me, I'm super educated now, and I'm not fit for a job." All I knew was that I had never seen a place so beautiful. I made a promise then that I would go to school at UCLA no matter what, come hell or high water. My desire had everything to do with me, and yet it was not driven by the need for immediate gratification. It was more in the realm of awe. I told Don Juan that my girlfriend's annoyance had been so jarring to me that it forced me to look at her in a different light, and that to my recollection, that was the first time ever that a commentary had aroused such a deep reaction in me. I saw facets of character in my girlfriend that I hadn't seen before, facets that scared me stiff. I think I judged her terribly, I said to Don Juan. After our visit to the campus, we drifted apart. It was as if UCLA had come between us like a wedge. I know that it's stupid to think this way. It isn't stupid, Don Juan said. It was a perfectly valid reaction. While you were walking on the campus, I am sure that you had a bout with intent. You intended being there, and anything that was opposed to it, you had to let go. But don't overdo it, he went on. The touch of warrior travelers is very light, although it is cultivated. The hand of a warrior traveler begins as a heavy, gripping iron hand, but becomes like the hand of a ghost, a hand made of gossamer. Warrior travelers leave no marks, no tracks. That's the challenge for warrior travelers. Don Juan's comments made me sink into a deep, morose state of recriminations against myself, for I knew from the little bit of my recounting that I was extremely heavy-handed, obsessive, and domineering. I told Don Juan about my ruminations. The power of the recapitulation, Don Juan said, is that it stirs up all the garbage of our lives and brings it to the surface. Then Don Juan delineated the intricacies of awareness and perception, which were the basis of the recapitulation. He began by saying that he was going to present an arrangement of concepts that I should not take as sorcerers' theories under any conditions, because it was an arrangement formulated by the shamans of ancient Mexico as a result of seeing energy directly as it flows in the universe. He warned me that he would present the units of this arrangement to me without any attempt at classifying them or ranking them by any predetermined standard. I'm not interested in classification, he went on. You have been classifying everything all your life. Now, you are going to be forced to stay away from classification. The other day when I asked you if you knew anything about clouds, you gave me the names of all the clouds and the percentage of moisture that one should expect from each one. You were a veritable weatherman, but when I asked you if you knew what you could do with the clouds personally, you had no idea what I was talking about. Classifications have a world of their own, he continued. After you begin to classify anything, the classification becomes alive, and it rules you. But since classifications never started as energy-giving affairs, they always remain like dead logs. They are not trees, they are merely logs. He explained that the sorcerers of ancient Mexico saw that the universe at large is composed of energy fields in the form of luminous filaments. They saw zillions of them wherever they turned to see. They also saw that those energy fields arrange themselves into currents of luminous fibers, streams that are constant, perennial forces in the universe, and that the current or stream of filaments that is related to the recapitulation was named by those sorcerers the Dark Sea of Awareness, and also the Eagle. He stated that those sorcerers also found out that every creature in the universe is attached to the Dark Sea of Awareness at a round point of luminosity that was apparent when those creatures were perceived as energy. On that point of luminosity, which the sorcerers of ancient Mexico called the assemblage point, Don Juan said that perception was assembled by a mysterious aspect of the Dark Sea of Awareness. Don Juan asserted that on the assemblage point of human beings, zillions of energy fields from the universe at large in the form of luminous filaments converge and go through it. These energy fields are converted into sensory data, and the sensory data is then interpreted and perceived as the world we know. Don Juan further explained that what turns the luminous fibers into sensory data is the Dark Sea of Awareness. Sorcerers see this transformation and call it the glow of awareness, a sheen that extends like a halo around the assemblage point. He warned me then that he was going to make a statement which, in the understanding of sorcerers, was central to comprehending the scope of the recapitulation. Putting an enormous emphasis on his words, he said that what we call the senses in organisms is nothing but degrees of awareness. He maintained that if we accept that the senses are the dark sea of awareness, we have to admit that the interpretation that the senses make of sensory data is also the dark sea of awareness. He explained at length that to face the world around us in the terms that we do is the result of the interpretation system of mankind with which every human being is equipped. He also said that every organism in existence has to have an interpretation system that permits it to function in its surroundings. The sorcerers who came after the apocalyptic upheavals I told you about, he continued, saw that at the moment of death, the dark sea of awareness sucked in, so to speak, through the assemblage point, the awareness of living creatures. They also saw that the dark sea of awareness had a moment's, let's say, hesitation when it was faced with sorcerers who had done a recounting of their lives. Unbeknownst to them, some had done it so thoroughly that the dark sea of awareness took their awareness in the form of their life experiences, but didn't touch their life force. Sorcerers had found out a gigantic truth about the forces of the universe. The dark sea of awareness wants only our life experiences, not our life force. The premises of Don Juan's elucidation were incomprehensible to me. Or perhaps it would be more accurate to say that I was vaguely and yet deeply cognizant of how functional the premises of his explanation were. Sorcerers believe, Don Juan went on, that as we recapitulate our lives, all the debris, as I told you, comes to the surface. We realize our inconsistency, our repetition, but something in us puts up a tremendous resistance to recapitulate. Sorcerers say that the road is free only after a gigantic upheaval, after the appearance on our screen of the memory of an event that shakes our foundations with its terrifying clarity of detail. It's the event that drags us to the actual moment that we lived in. Sorcerers call that event the usher, because from then on, every event we touch on is relived, not merely remembered. Walking is always something that precipitates memories, Don Juan went on. The sorcerers of ancient Mexico believed that everything we live, we store as a sensation on the backs of the legs. They considered the backs of the legs to be the warehouse of man's personal history. So, let's go for a walk in the hills now. We walked until it was almost dark. I think I have made you walk long enough, Don Juan said when we were back at his house, to have you ready to begin this sorcerer's maneuver of finding an usher, an event in your life that you will remember with such clarity that it will serve as a spotlight to illuminate everything else in your recapitulation with the same or comparable clarity. Do what sorcerers call recapitulating pieces of a puzzle. Something will lead you to remember the event that will serve as your usher. He left me alone, giving me one last warning. Give it your best shot, he said. Do your best. I was extremely silent for a moment, perhaps due to the silence around me. I experienced then a vibration, a sort of jolt in my chest. I had difficulty breathing, but suddenly something opened up in my chest that allowed me to take a deep breath, and a total view of a forgotten event of my childhood burst into my memory, as if it had been held captive and was suddenly released. I was at my grandfather's studio, where he had a billiard table, and I was playing billiards with him. I was almost 9 years old then. My grandfather was quite a skillful player, and compulsively he had taught me every play he knew until I was good enough to have a serious match with him. We spent endless hours playing billiards. I became so proficient at it that one day I defeated him. From that day on, he was incapable of winning. Many a time, I deliberately threw the game just to be nice to him, but he knew it and would become furious with me. Once, He got so upset that he hit me on the top of the head with the cue. To my grandfather's chagrin and delight, by the time I was 9 years old, I could make carom after carom without stopping. He became so frustrated and impatient in a game with me once that he threw down his cue and told me to play by myself. My compulsive nature made it possible for me to compete with myself and work the same play on and on until I got it perfectly. One day, a man notorious in town for his gambling connections, the owner of a billiards house, came to visit my grandfather. They were talking and playing billiards as I happened to enter the room. I instantly tried to retreat, but my grandfather grabbed me and pulled me in. "This is my grandson," he said to the man. "Very pleased to meet you," the man said. He looked at me sternly and then extended his hand, which was the size of the head of a normal person. I was horrified. His enormous burst of laughter told me that he was cognizant of my discomfort. He told me that his name was Falelo Quiroga, and I mumbled my name. He was very tall and extremely well dressed. He was wearing a double-breasted blue pinstriped suit with beautifully tapered trousers. He must have been in his early 50s then, but he was trim and fit except for a slight bulge in his midsection. He wasn't fat. He seemed to cultivate the look of a man who is well-fed and is not in need of anything. Most of the people in my hometown were gaunt. They were people who labored hard to earn a living and had no time for niceties. Falelo Quiroga appeared to be the opposite. His whole demeanor was that of a man who had time only for niceties. He was pleasant-looking. He had a bland, well-shaven face with kind blue eyes. He had the air and the confidence of a doctor. People in my town used to say that he was capable of putting anyone at ease and that he should have been a priest, a lawyer, or a doctor instead of a gambler. They also used to say that he made more money gambling than all the doctors and lawyers in town put together made by working. His hair was black and carefully combed. It was obviously thinning considerably. He tried to hide his receding hairline by combing his hair over his forehead. He had a square jaw and an absolutely winning smile. He had big white teeth, which were well cared for, the ultimate novelty in an area where tooth decay was monumental. Two other remarkable features of Falelo Quiroga for me were his enormous feet and his handmade black patent leather shoes. I was fascinated by the fact that his shoes didn't squeak at all as he walked back and forth in the room. I was accustomed to hearing my grandfather's approach by the squeak of the soles of his shoes. "My grandson plays billiards quite well," my grandfather said nonchalantly to Falelo Quiroga. "Why don't I give him my cue and let him play with you while I watch?" "This child plays billiards?" the big man asked my grandfather with a laugh. "Oh, he does," my grandfather assured him. "Of course, not as well as you do, Falelo. Why don't you try him? And to make it interesting for you, so you won't be patronizing my grandson, let's bet a little money. What do you say if we bet this much?" He put a thick wad of crumpled-up bills on the table and smiled at Falelo Quiroga, shaking his head from side to side as if daring the big man to take his bet. "My, oh my, that much, eh?" Falelo Quiroga said, looking at me questioningly. He opened his wallet then and pulled out some neatly folded bills. This, for me, was another surprising detail. My grandfather's habit was to carry his money in every one of his pockets, all crumpled up. When he needed to pay for something, he had to straighten out the bills in order to count them. Falelo Quiroga didn't say it, but I knew that he felt like a highway robber. He smiled at my grandfather, and obviously out of respect for him, he put his money on the table. My grandfather, acting as the arbiter, set the game at a certain number of caroms and flipped a coin to see who would start first. Falelo Quiroga won. "You better give it all you have without holding back," my grandfather urged him. "Don't have any qualms about demolishing this twerp and winning my money." Falelo Quiroga, following my grandfather's advice, played as hard as he was able. But at one point, he missed one carom by a hair. I took the cue. I thought I was going to faint, but seeing my grandfather's glee, he was jumping up and down, calmed me. And besides, it irked me to see Falelo Quiroga about to split his sides laughing when he saw the way I held the cue. I couldn't lean over the table, as billiards is normally played, because of my height. But my grandfather, with painstaking patience and determination, had taught me an alternative way of playing. By extending my arm all the way back, I held the cue nearly above my shoulders to the side. "What does he do when he has to reach the middle of the table?" Falelo Quiroga asked, laughing. "He hangs on the edge of the table," my grandfather said, matter-of-factly. "It's permissible, you know." My grandfather came to me and whispered through clenched teeth that if I tried to be polite and lose, he was going to break all the cues on my head. I knew he didn't mean it. This was just his way of expressing his confidence in me. I won easily. My grandfather was delighted beyond description, but strangely enough, so was Falelo Quiroga. He laughed as he went around the pool table, slapping its edges. My grandfather praised me to the skies. He revealed to Quiroga my best score and joked that I had excelled because he'd found the way to lure me to practice. Coffee with Danish pastry. "You don't say, you don't say," Quiroga kept repeating. He said goodbye. My grandfather picked up the bet money, and the incident was forgotten. My grandfather promised to take me to a restaurant and buy me the best meal in town, but he never did. He was very stingy. He was known to be a lavish spender, only with women. 2 days later, 2 enormous men affiliated with Falelo Quiroga came to me at the time that I got out from school and was leaving. "Falelo Quiroga wants to see you," one of them said in a guttural tone. "He wants you to go to his place and have some coffee and Danish pastries with him." If he hadn't said coffee and Danish pastries, I probably would have run away from them. I remembered then that my grandfather had told Falelo Quiroga that I would sell my soul for coffee and Danish pastries. I gladly went with them. However, I couldn't walk as fast as they did. So one of them, the one whose name was Guillermo Falcon, picked me up and cradled me in his huge arms. He laughed through crooked teeth. "You better enjoy the ride, kid," he said. His breath was terrible. "Have you ever been carried by anyone? Judging by the way you wriggle, never." He giggled grotesquely. Fortunately, Falelo Quiroga's place was not too far from the school. Mr. Falcon deposited me on a couch in an office. Falelo Quiroga was there, sitting behind a huge desk. He stood up and shook hands with me. He immediately had some coffee and delicious pastries brought to me, and the two of us sat there chatting amiably about my grandfather's chicken farm. He asked me if I would like to have more pastries, and I said that I wouldn't mind if I did. He laughed, and he himself brought me a whole tray of unbelievably delicious pastries from the next room. After I'd veritably gorged myself, he politely asked me if I would consider coming to his billiards place in the wee hours of the night to play a couple of friendly games with some people of his choice. He casually mentioned that a considerable amount of money was going to be involved. He openly expressed his trust in my skill and added that he was going to pay me for my time and my effort a percentage of the winning money. He further stated that he knew the mentality of my family. They would have found it improper that he give me money even though it was pay. So, he promised to put the money in the bank in a special account for me, or more practical yet, he would cover any purchase that I made in any of the stores in town or the food I consumed in any restaurant in town. I didn't believe a word of what he was saying. I knew that Falelo Quiroga was a crook, a racketeer. I liked, however, the idea of playing billiards with people I didn't know, and I struck a bargain with him. "Will you give me some coffee and Danish pastries like the ones you gave me today?" I said. "Of course, my boy," he replied. "If you come to play for me, I will buy you the bakery. I will have the baker bake them just for you. Take my word." I warned Falelo Quiroga that the only drawback was my incapacity to get out of my house. I had too many aunts who watched me like hawks, and besides, my bedroom was on the second floor. "That's no problem," Falelo Quiroga assured me. "You're quite small. Mr. Falcon will catch you if you jump from your window into his arms. He's as big as a house. I recommend that you go to bed early tonight. Mr. Falcon will wake you up by whistling and throwing rocks at your window. You have to watch out, though. He's an impatient man." I went home in the midst of the most astounding excitation. I couldn't go to sleep. I was quite awake when I heard Mr. Falcon whistling and throwing small pebbles against the glass panes of the window. I opened the window. Mr. Falcon was right below me on the street. "Jump into my arms, kid," he said to me in a constricted voice which he tried to modulate into a loud whisper. "If you don't aim at my arms, I'll drop you and you'll die. Remember that. Don't make me run around, just aim at my arms. Jump! Jump!" I did, and he caught me with the ease of someone catching a bag of cotton. He put me down and told me to run. He said that I was a child awakened from a deep sleep and that he had to make me run so I would be fully awake by the time I got to the billiards house. I played that night with 2 men, and I won both games. I had the most delicious coffee and pastries that one could imagine. Personally, I was in heaven. It was around 7 in the morning when I returned home. Nobody had noticed my absence. It was time to go to school. For all practical purposes, everything was normal, except for the fact that I was so tired that I couldn't keep my eyes open all day. From that day on, Falelo Quiroga sent Mr. Falcon to pick me up 2 or 3 times a week, and I won every game that he made me play. And faithful to his promise, he paid for anything that I bought, including meals at my favorite Chinese restaurant, where I used to go daily. Sometimes I even invited my friends, whom I mortified to no end by running out of the restaurant screaming when the waiter brought the bill. They were amazed at the fact that they were never taken to the police for consuming food and not paying for it. What was an ordeal for me was that I had never conceived of the fact that I would have to contend with the hopes and expectations of all the people who bet on me. The ordeal of ordeals, however, took place when a crack player from a nearby city challenged Falelo Quiroga and backed his challenge with a giant bet. The night of the game was an inauspicious night. My grandfather became ill and couldn't fall asleep. The entire family was in an uproar. It appeared that nobody went to bed. I doubted that I had any possibility of sneaking out of my bedroom, but Mr. Falcon's whistling and the pebbles hitting the glass of my window were so insistent that I took a chance and jumped from my window into Mr. Falcon's arms. It seemed that every male in town had congregated at the billiards place. Anguished faces silently begged me not to lose. Some of the men boldly assured me that they had bet their houses and all their belongings. One man, in a half-joking tone, said that he had bet his wife. If I didn't win, he would be a cuckold that night or a murderer. He didn't specify whether he meant he would kill his wife in order not to be a cuckold, or me for losing the game. Falelo Quiroga paced back and forth. He had hired a masseur to massage me. He wanted me relaxed. The masseur put hot towels on my arms and wrists and cold towels on my forehead. He put on my feet the most comfortable soft shoes that I had ever worn. They had hard military heels and arch support. Falelo Quiroga even outfitted me with a beret to keep my hair from falling in my face, as well as a pair of loose overalls with a belt. Half of the people around the billiard table were strangers from another town. They glared at me. They gave me the feeling that they wanted me dead. Falelo Quiroga flipped a coin to decide who would go first. My opponent was a Brazilian of Chinese descent, young, round-faced, very spiffy and confident. He started first, and he made a staggering amount of caroms. I knew by the color of his face that Falelo Quiroga was about to have a heart attack, and so were the other people who had bet everything they had on me. I played very well that night, and as I approached the number of caroms that the other man had made, the nervousness of the ones who had bet on me reached its peak. Falelo Quiroga was the most hysterical of them all. He yelled at everybody and demanded that someone open the windows because the cigarette smoke made the air unbreathable for me. He wanted the masseur to relax my arms and shoulders. Finally, I had to stop everyone, and in a real hurry, I made the 8 caroms that I needed to win. The euphoria of those who had bet on me was indescribable. I was oblivious to all that, for it was already morning, and they had to take me home in a hurry. My exhaustion that day knew no limits. Very obligingly, Falelo Quiroga didn't send for me for a whole week. However, one afternoon, Mr. Falcon picked me up from school and took me to the billiards house. Falelo Quiroga was extremely serious. He didn't even offer me coffee or Danish pastries. He sent everybody out of his office and got directly to the point. He pulled his chair close to me. "I have put a lot of money in the bank for you," he said, very solemnly. "I am true to what I promised you. I give you my word that I will always look after you. You know that. Now, if you do what I'm going to tell you to do, you will make so much money that you won't have to work a day in your life. I want you to lose your next game by 1 carom. I know that you can do it, but I want you to miss by only a hair. The more dramatic, the better." I was dumbfounded. All of this was incomprehensible to me. Falelo Quiroga repeated his request and further explained that he was going to bet anonymously all he had against me, and that was the nature of our new deal. "Mr. Falcon has been guarding you for months," he said. "All I need to tell you is that Mr. Falcon uses all his force to protect you, but he could do the opposite with the same strength." Falelo Quiroga's threat couldn't have been more obvious. He must have seen in my face the horror that I felt, for he relaxed and laughed. "Oh, but don't you worry about things like that," he said reassuringly, "because we are brothers." This was the first time in my life that I'd been placed in an untenable position. I wanted with all my might to run away from Falelo Quiroga, from the fear that he had evoked in me. But at the same time, and with equal force, I wanted to stay. I wanted the ease of being able to buy anything I wanted from any store, and above all, the ease of being able to eat at any restaurant of my choice without paying. I was never confronted, however, with having to choose one or the other. Unexpectedly, at least for me, my grandfather moved to another area, quite distant. It was as if he knew what was going on, and he sent me ahead of everyone else. I doubted that he actually knew what was taking place. It seemed that sending me away was one of his usual intuitive actions. Don Juan's return brought me out of my recollection. I'd lost track of time. I should have been famished, but I wasn't hungry at all. I was filled with nervous energy. Don Juan lit a kerosene lantern and hung it from a nail on the wall. Its dim light cast strange dancing shadows in the room. It took a moment for my eyes to adjust to the semi-darkness. I entered then into a state of profound sadness. It was a strangely detached feeling, a far-reaching longing that came from that semi-darkness, or perhaps from the sensation of being trapped. I was so tired that I wanted to leave, but at the same time and with the same force, I wanted to stay. Don Juan's voice brought me a measure of control. He appeared to know the reason for and the depth of my turmoil, and modulated his voice to fit the occasion. The severity of his tone helped me to gain control over something that could easily have turned into a hysterical reaction to fatigue and mental stimulation. To recount events is magical for sorcerers, he said. It isn't just telling stories, it is seeing the underlying fabric of events. This is the reason recounting is so important and vast. At his request, I told Don Juan the event I'd recollected. How appropriate, he said, and chuckled with delight. The only commentary I can make is that warrior travelers roll with the punches. They go wherever the impulse may take them. The power of warrior travelers is to be alert to get maximum effect from minimal impulse. And above all, their power lies in not interfering. Events have a force, a gravity of their own, and travelers are just travelers. Everything around them is for their eyes alone. In this fashion, travelers construct the meaning of every situation without ever asking how it happened this way or that way. Today, you remembered an event that sums up your total life, he continued. You are always faced with a situation that is the same as the one that you never resolved. You never really had to choose whether to accept or reject Falelo Quiroga's crooked deal. Infinity always puts us in this terrible position of having to choose, he went on. We want infinity, but at the same time, we want to run away from it. You want to tell me to go and jump in a lake, but at the same time, you are compelled to stay. It would be infinitely easier for you to just be compelled to stay. The interplay of energy on the horizon. The clarity of the usher brought a new impetus to my recapitulation. A new mood replaced the old one. From then on, I began to recollect events in my life with maddening clarity. It was exactly as if a barrier had been built inside me that had kept me holding rigidly on to meager and unclear memories, and the usher had smashed it. My memory faculty had been, for me, prior to that event, a vague way of referring to things that had happened, but which I wanted, most of the time, to forget. Basically, I had no interest whatsoever in remembering anything of my life. Therefore, I honestly saw absolutely no point in this futile exercise of recapitulating, which Don Juan had practically imposed on me. For me, it was a chore that tired me instantly and did nothing but point out my incapacity for concentrating. I had dutifully made, nevertheless, lists of people, and I had engaged in a haphazard effort of quasi-remembering my interactions with them. My lack of clarity in bringing those people into focus didn't dissuade me. I fulfilled what I considered to be my duty, regardless of the way I really felt. With practice, the clarity of my recollection improved, I thought, remarkably. I was able to descend, so to speak, on certain choice events with a fair amount of keenness that was at once scary and rewarding. After Don Juan presented me with the idea of the usher, however, the power of my recollection became something for which I had no name. Following my list of people made the recapitulation extremely formal and exigent, the way Don Juan wanted it. But from time to time, something in me got loose. Something that forced me to focus on events unrelated to my list, events whose clarity was so maddening that I was caught and submerged in them, perhaps even more intensely than I had been when I had lived the experiences themselves. Every time I recapitulated in such a fashion, I had a degree of detachment, which allowed me to see things I disregarded when I had really been in the throes of them. The first time in which the recollection of an event shook me to my foundations happened after I had given a lecture at a college in Oregon. The students in charge of organizing the lecture took me and another anthropology friend of mine to a house to spend the night. I was going to go to a motel, but they insisted, for our comfort, on taking us to this house. They said that it was in the country, and there were no noises, quietest place in the world, with no telephones, no interference from the outside world. I, like the fool that I was, agreed to go with them. Don Juan had not only warned me to always be a solitary bird, he had demanded that I observe his recommendation, something that I did most of the time, but there were occasions when the gregarious creature in me took the upper hand. The committee took us to the house quite a distance from Portland of a professor who was on sabbatical. Very swiftly, they turned on the lights inside and outside of the house, which was located on a hill with spotlights all around it. With the spotlights on, the house must have been visible from 5 miles away. After that, the committee took off as fast as they could, something that surprised me because I thought they were going to stay and talk. The house was a wooden A-frame, small but very well constructed. It had an enormous living room and a mezzanine above it, where the bedroom was. Right above, at the apex of the A-frame, there was a life-size crucifix hanging from a strange rotating hinge, which was drilled into the head of the figure. The spotlights on the wall were focused on the crucifix. It was quite an impressive sight, especially when it rotated, squeaking as if the hinge needed oil. The bathroom of the house was another sight. It had mirrored tiles on the ceiling, the walls, and the floor, and it was illuminated with a reddish light. There was no way to go to the bathroom without seeing yourself from every conceivable angle. I enjoyed all those features of the house, which seemed to me stupendous. When the time came for me to go to sleep, however, I encountered a serious problem because there was only one narrow, hard, quite monastic bed, and my anthropologist friend was close to having pneumonia, wheezing and retching phlegm every time he coughed. He went straight for the bed and passed out. I looked for a place to sleep. I couldn't find one. That house was barren of comforts. Besides, it was cold. The committee had turned on the lights, but not the heater. I looked for the heater. My search was fruitless, as was my search for the switch to the spotlights, or to any of the lights in the house, for that matter. The switches were there on the walls, but they seemed to be overruled by the effect of some main switch. The lights were on, and I had no way to turn them off. The only place I could find to sleep was on a thin throw rug, and the only thing I found with which I could cover myself was the tanned hide of a giant French poodle. Obviously, it had been the pet of the house and had been preserved. It had shiny black marble eyes and an open mouth with a tongue hanging out. I put the head of the poodle skin toward my knees. I still had to cover myself with the tanned rear end, which was on my neck. Its preserved head was like a hard object between my knees, quite unsettling. If it had been dark, it wouldn't have been as bad. I gathered a bundle of washcloths and used them as a pillow. I used as many as possible to cover the hide of the French poodle the best way I could. I couldn't sleep all night. It was then, as I lay there cursing myself silently for being so stupid and not following Don Juan's recommendation, that I had the first maddeningly clear recollection of my entire life. I had recollected the event that Don Juan had called the usher with equal clarity, but my tendency had always been to half disregard what happened to me when I was with Don Juan, on the basis that, in his presence, anything was possible. This time, however, I was alone. Years before I met Don Juan, I had worked painting signs on buildings. My boss's name was Luigi Palma. One day, Luigi got a contract to paint a sign advertising the sale and rental of bridal gowns and tuxedos on the back wall of an old building. The owner of the store in the building wanted to catch the eye of possible customers with a large display. Luigi was going to paint a bride and groom, and I was going to do the lettering. We went to the flat roof of the building and set up a scaffold. I was quite apprehensive, although I had no overt reason to be so. I had painted dozens of signs on high buildings. Luigi thought that I was beginning to be afraid of heights, but that my fear was going to pass. When the time came to start working, he lowered the scaffold a few feet from the roof and jumped onto its flat boards. He went to one side, while I stood on the other in order to be totally out of his way. He was the artist. Luigi began to show off. His painting movements were so erratic and agitated that the scaffold moved back and forth. I became dizzy. I wanted to go back to the flat roof using the pretext that I needed more paint and other painter's paraphernalia. I grabbed the edge of the wall that fringed the flat roof and tried to hoist myself up, but the tips of my feet got stuck in the boards of the scaffold. I tried to pull my feet and the scaffold toward the wall. The harder I pulled, the farther away I pushed the scaffold from the wall. Instead of helping me untangle my feet, Luigi sat down and braced himself with the cords that attached the scaffold to the flat roof. He crossed himself and looked at me in horror. From his sitting position, he knelt, weeping quietly as he recited the Lord's Prayer. I held on to the edge of the wall for dear life. What gave me the desperate strength to endure was the certainty that if I was in control, I could keep the scaffold from moving farther and farther away. I wasn't going to lose my grip and fall 13 floors to my death. Luigi, being a compulsive taskmaster to the bitter end, yelled to me in the midst of tears that I should pray. He swore that both of us were going to fall to our deaths, and that the least we could do was pray for the salvation of our souls. For a moment, I deliberated about whether it was functional to pray. I opted to yell for help. People in the building must have heard my yelling and sent for the firemen. I sincerely thought that it had taken only 2 or 3 seconds after I began to yell for the firemen to come onto the roof and grab Luigi and me and secure the scaffold. In reality, I had hung on to the side of the building for at least 20 minutes. When the firemen finally pulled me onto the roof, I had lost any vestige of control. I vomited on the hard floor of the roof, sick to my stomach from fear and the odious smell of melted tar. It was a very hot day. The tar on the cracks of the scratchy roofing sheets was melting in the heat. The ordeal had been so frightening and embarrassing that I didn't want to remember it, and I ended up hallucinating that the firemen had pulled me into a warm, yellow room. They had then put me in a supremely comfortable bed, and I had fallen peacefully asleep, safe, wearing my pajamas, delivered from danger. My second recollection was another blast of incommensurable force. I was talking amiably to a group of friends when, for no apparent reason I could account for, I suddenly lost my breath under the impact of a thought, a memory, which was vague for an instant, and then became an engrossing experience. Its force was so intense that I had to excuse myself and retreat for a moment to a corner. My friends seemed to understand my reaction. They disbanded without any comments. What I was remembering was an incident that had taken place in my last year of high school. My best friend and I used to walk to school passing a big mansion with a black wrought iron fence at least 7 feet high and ending in pointed spikes. Behind the fence was an extensive, well-kept green lawn and a huge, ferocious German Shepherd dog. Every day, we used to tease the dog and let him charge at us. He stopped physically at the wrought iron fence, but his rage seemed to cross over to us. My friend delighted in engaging the dog every day in a contest of mind over matter. He used to stand a few inches from the dog's snout, which protruded between the iron bars at least 6 inches into the street, and bare his teeth, just like the dog did. "Yield! Yield!" my friend shouted every time. "Obey! Obey! I'm more powerful than you." His daily displays of mental power, which lasted at least 5 minutes, never affected the dog outside of leaving him more furious than ever. My friend assured me daily, as part of his ritual, that the dog was either going to obey him or die in front of us of heart failure brought about by rage. His conviction was so intense that I believed that the dog was going to drop dead any day. One morning, when we came around, the dog wasn't there. We waited for a moment, but he didn't show up. Then we saw him at the end of the extensive lawn. He seemed to be busy there, so we slowly began to walk away. From the corner of my eye, I noticed that the dog was running at full speed toward us. When he was perhaps 6 or 7 feet from the fence, he took a gigantic leap over it. I was sure that he was going to rip his belly on the spikes. He barely cleared them and fell onto the street like a sack of potatoes. I thought for a moment that he was dead, but he was only stunned. Suddenly, he got up, and instead of chasing after the one who had brought about his rage, he ran after me. I jumped onto the roof of a car, but the car was nothing for the dog. He took a leap and was nearly on top of me. I scrambled down and climbed the first tree that was within reach, a flimsy little tree that could barely support my weight. I was sure that it would snap in the middle, sending me right into the dog's jaws to be mauled to death. In the tree, I was nearly out of his reach. But the dog jumped again and snapped his teeth, catching me by the seat of my pants and ripping them. His teeth actually nicked my buttocks. The moment I was safe at the top of the tree, the dog left. He just ran up the street, perhaps looking for my friend. At the infirmary in school, the nurse told me that I had to ask the owner of the dog for a certificate of rabies vaccination. "You must look into this," she said severely. "You may have rabies already. If the owner refuses to show you the vaccination certificate, you are within your rights to call the police." I talked to the caretaker of the mansion where the dog lived. He accused me of luring the owner's most valuable dog, a pedigreed animal, out into the street. "You better watch out, boy," he said in an angry tone. "The dog got lost. The owner will send you to jail if you keep on bothering us." "But I may have rabies," I said in a sincerely terrified tone. "I don't give a shit if you have the bubonic plague," the man snapped. "Scram!" "I'll call the police," I said. "Call whoever you like," he retorted. "You call the police, we'll turn them against you. In this house, we have enough clout to do that." I believed him. So I lied to the nurse and said that the dog could not be found and that it had no owner. "Oh my God," the woman exclaimed. "Then brace yourself for the worst. I may have to send you to the doctor." She gave me a long list of symptoms that I should look for or wait for until they manifested themselves. She said that the injections for rabies were extremely painful and that they had to be administered subcutaneously on the area of the abdomen. "I wouldn't wish that treatment on my worst enemy," she said, plunging me into a horrid nightmare. What followed was my first real depression. I just lay in my bed, feeling every one of the symptoms enumerated by the nurse. I ended up going to the school infirmary and begging the woman to give me the treatment for rabies, no matter how painful. I made a huge scene. I became hysterical. I didn't have rabies, but I had totally lost my control. I related to Don Juan my 2 recollections and all their details, sparing nothing. He didn't make any comments. He nodded a few times. "In both recollections, Don Juan," I said, feeling myself the urgency of my voice, "I was as hysterical as anyone could be. My body was trembling. I was sick to my stomach. I don't want to say it was as if I were in the experiences, because that's not the truth. I was in the experiences themselves both times, and when I couldn't take them anymore, I jumped into my life now. For me, that was a jump into the future. I had the power of going over time. My jump into the past was not abrupt. The event developed slowly, as memories do, It was at the end that I did jump abruptly into the future, my life now.
Something in you has begun to collapse, for sure,
he finally said.
It has been collapsing all along, but it repaired itself very quickly every time its supports failed. My feeling is that it is now collapsing totally.
After another long silence, Don Juan explained that the sorcerers of ancient Mexico believed that, as he had told me already, we had two minds, and only one of them was truly ours. I had always understood Don Juan as saying that there were two parts to our minds, and one of them was always silent because expression was denied to it by the force of the other part. Whatever Don Juan had said, I had taken as a metaphorical way to explain, perhaps, the apparent dominance of the left hemisphere of the brain over the right, or something of the like.
There is a secret option to the recapitulation, Don Juan said. Just like I told you that there is a secret option to dying, an option that only sorcerers take. In the case of dying, the secret option is that human beings could retain their life force and relinquish only their awareness, the product of their lives. In the case of the recapitulation, the secret option that only sorcerers take is to choose to enhance their true minds. The haunting memory of your recollections, he went on, could come only from your true mind. The other mind that we all have and share is, I would say, a cheap model. Economy strength, one size fits all. But this is a subject that we will discuss later. What is at stake now is the advent of a disintegrating force, but not a force that is disintegrating you. I don't mean it that way. It is disintegrating what the sorcerers call the foreign installation, which exists in you and in every other human being. The effect of the force that is descending on you, which is disintegrating the foreign installation, is that it pulls sorcerers out of their syntax.
I had listened carefully to Don Juan, but I couldn't say that I had understood what he'd said. For some strange reason, which was to me as unknown as the cause of my vivid recollections, I couldn't ask him any question.
I know how difficult it is for you, Don Juan said all of a sudden, to deal with this facet of your life. Every sorcerer that I know has gone through it. The males going through it suffer infinitely more damage than the females. I suppose it's the condition of women to be more durable. The sorcerers of ancient Mexico, acting as a group, tried their best to buttress the impact of this disintegrating force. In our day, we have no means of acting as a group, so we must brace ourselves to face, in solitude, a force that will sweep us away from language. For there is no way to describe adequately what is going on.
Don Juan was right in that I was at a loss for explanations or ways of describing the effect that those recollections had had on me. Don Juan had told me that sorcerers face the unknown in the most common incidents one can imagine. When they are confronted with it and cannot interpret what they're perceiving, they have to rely on an outside source for direction. Don Juan had called that source infinity, or the voice of the spirit, and had said that if sorcerers don't try to be rational about what can't be rationalized, the spirit unerringly tells them what's what. Don Juan had guided me to accept the idea that infinity was a force that had a voice and was conscious of itself. Consequently, he had prepared me to be ready to listen to that voice and act efficiently always, but without antecedents, using as little as possible the railings of the a priori. I waited impatiently for the voice of the spirit to tell me the meaning of my recollections, but nothing happened. I was in a bookstore one day when a girl recognized me and came over to talk to me. She was tall and slim and had an insecure little girl's voice. I was trying to make her feel at ease when I was suddenly accosted by an instantaneous, energetic change. It was as if an alarm had been triggered in me, and as it had happened in the past, without any volition on my part whatsoever, I recollected another completely forgotten event in my life.
the memory of my grandparents' house flooded me. It was a veritable avalanche, so intense that it was devastating, and once more I had to retreat to a corner. My body shook as if I'd taken a chill. I must have been 8 years old. My grandfather was talking to me. He'd begun by telling me that it was his utmost duty to set me straight. I had 2 cousins who were my age.